G'day friends and fans, welcome to Dave Talks Stuff Ukraine War Update for the 5th of November 2025. I'm your host, the author David Applegate, author of the books The Boyhood of Cade, Power Games, Into the Elsebound, and the Erotic Tales from the Empire. The war continues, and according to YouTube, most of you tune out before I even get to what the war news is. But also, according to YouTube, I have hundreds of watch hours yesterday. So, it's really weird. Something's really wrong. Did a handful of people watch my videos? Maybe. But if you divide the watch hours by the number of people, it's longer than the video. But if you look at the watch time, and divide that by the number of by the length of the video watch time. So the average watch divided by the total watch time divided by the average watch time comes to way more than the number of people who watched. And again, if you multiply the average watch time by the number of people who watched, it comes out nowhere near. YouTube metrics don't add up. And it's just continuing to get worse. And then when you ask YouTube, they say, well, it may take 24 hours. Well, it's been more than that. And even if you look at the graph doesn't match the numbers that they give. This is like the Ukraine war. The media makes reports, but the numbers don't add up. Now, I know from the Russian side their estimates, and they never give their own estimates. But there's it's over 2 years now, and the number of ceremonies in Ukraine, with the number of body handovers, you see the number of Ukrainians to the number of Russians, it's 70-30. Okay, 70% of the casualties are Ukrainian. So the Russians reporting 1,000 people that they took out 1,400 Ukrainians. Divide that by 100 times that by 30. So if it's 1,700, that's about 17 times 30, and you get. Let's just do the maths, okay? Sorry, not going to do it off the top of my head, sorry. So, you got 1,400 according to the Russians, right? So you divide by 100 and times by 30, and you get 420. And you look at the troop rotations and the number of recruitments reported by Russians, and it's a steady number every month. If Russians were losing that many people, and you also hear Ukrainian opposition always say they're 30k short, 50k short, you know. Now, they say monthly, but I think they actually meant quarterly. I think that's actually a bad translation. Because the Ukrainian army is recruiting every day. But their recruitment rotation takes them anywhere from 1 to 3 months to get somebody to the battlefield. I know it sounds bad, because the US troop training is anywhere from 6 to 12 months out of a 4-year stint. And don't actually have the numbers. But according to some in the Ukrainian army, they have people who've been in the army now 10, 12 years who haven't been released from their time. And also combat time reduces your service time, and there's no there's no relief. They're saying that people aren't even allowed off the front now in some areas at all. And now we do know that the Russians have bought thousands of these Chinese quad bikes. And it's mixed. Every video I've seen of Russian quad bikes, they're actually performing well. But every time I see videos of the Chinese quad bikes, they don't actually look like a quad bike. They look more like a golf cart, and they're performing poorly. Their wheels are disproportionately too small. I forget the actual ratio. Somebody worked it out. I think it was actually Henry Ford worked out the wheel ratio. So like, it's right. Of a buggy was actually half the size of a car or less. A buggy actually needed bigger wheels to move at the same speed as a car. I don't know how this physics worked out or something, but the car has the right length and the wheel ratio to move 4 people at 50. I actually think the calculation was 30 miles an hour, but it sort of fits for 55. 60, the cars start to wobble. It's all about the vibration. People work this stuff out all the time. And this does actually have a meaningful import, and I'm getting to that. So we look to tanks. Now, you notice tanks have a two big cogwheels. Then they have what you would call the suspension. Those are the two big ones. Those are the ones that at the bottom, that spread the track out. And then you had the guide wheels. Now, I notice in a lot of Russian tanks, the guide wheels are a very big weak point. And that's why they have a skirt. But I think they're too small. I do think the Russian tanks, though, however, do move too slow because their guide wheels, some of them and their gear ratios, they're wrong. There's something wrong. They're not 1.43. They're out. They're skewed. I don't know if this is a problem with Russian engineering, or they think that 1.28 is better, or it's just a cost-saving factor. But they need to fix the ratios, right? Some of their tanks have turrets that are too big. Some of them have a weird barrel length. But then again, in World War II, the Americans added a barrel extender to a lot of their tanks. So the Russians may have done this because the Americans did this. And I don't know either way if it's effective or not. But you can't keep relying on numbers. Now, one of the reasons why the Russians are relying on numbers is, yes, they're losing less than people in the West make out to be. But, behind the scenes, Putin is worried. You can see now and again he does look worried. And that is political pressure. The Duma, allegedly, rumoured to want this war to be contained and limited, and they don't want a wider war. Okay, they've written off Europe. Okay, they want a relationship with America still, but they've written off Europe. Trump wants to, Europe doesn't want peace. Europe is totally feminist. Okay, they want drama. They want to save their enemies suffering. It's total corruption. And I just can't seem to reach people, whether it's my voice or whatever. I'm not getting enough feedback. But there are people who do recognise and come back regularly, particularly on BitChute, and they do recognise some of the problem, not all of the problem. Maybe that's because there isn't enough conversation. I don't know. But Zelensky is definitely the problem. Keir Starmer's definitely the problem. The weak German government is the main problem. And yes, they are cucked by Israel, I know that. Stop whining about it and start doing something about it. Same with France. Macron. But I would say it's 70-30. 70% of the problem, you're focused on the 30% of the problem, not the 70% of the problem. I know getting rid of them, I know solving one helps reduce the number of problems, but you can't solve all the problems with the same solution, okay? Feminism is a bigger problem than Zionism. Islamism is a bigger problem than Zionism. But yes, the socialism is a bigger problem. But no, as big. But the biggest problem in Ukraine is the cunts, cowards, and thieves are in charge. And that is because they pander to the majority. Okay? The problem with the world is the majority of people are not good. They're selfish. The majority of Christians are not practicing Christianity. Otherwise, their wives wouldn't be bullying them, wearing makeup, or wanting jewelry. Now, Ukraine claims Zelensky met troops near the Battle of Pavlovsk. Dude, that's a room, okay? I bet you would find that in... This looks like Zelensky's bunker back in Poland. Or Kiev. I mean Kiev. Of course. This is the problem. Okay, Zelensky visited the troops. I met with my brothers at the command post of Azov battalions. Dopapilia! In the Pavlovsk area, Dopapilia is 66 fucking miles north. The Russians are not in Dopapilia. A town 20 miles from Pavlovsk. No, 60 miles. Look, we have a fucking map. Okay, maybe it is. Maybe it isn't that far. Maybe it isn't 60. Maybe I got a number stuck in my head. Fucking hell. I know where Pavlovsk is. It's right. God, now the map's jammed. God damn, I hate when that happens. Alright. There's Pavlovsk. I visited Pavlovsk. Not 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, look. 2, 4. Look. Up here. What a hero. Although he is 12 miles from the front line. Yay. Actually, the boss is down here. And he's up here. Allegedly. But this is the town we liberated. Remember? This is the problem. The majority have all this information at their fingertips and they never, ever use a search engine. They never check anything. But Russians have advanced and remain firm control. They claim Zelensky conducted drone strikes in petrochemical camp 1,300 times. Okay, we zoom out. Where's the petrochemical camp? 1,300? Really? 2, 4, 6, 8. And it was a substation near Moscow. This is Ukraine's own source, by the way. The Guardian are making shit up. And they know they're making shit up. It's not an oil refinery. They hit a substation. A power substation. They can't even get their story straight between Reuters, AP, and The Guardian. They cannot focus on one thing and get one thing right across multiple platforms. It's like none of them are actually reading the newswire. It's like they're sitting at their desks trying to come up with ways of manufacturing consent to send you to war so they can have their clickbait and their feel-good jobs and then they can have their brown society where they walk around feeling superior because they're not a racist or something. They're totally off their fucking rocker. I know my language upsets people. Too bad. Stop being crybabies, for Christ's sake. There are more bloody important things than the airs and graces of proper enunciation. Right? It's like liberals. You debate a liberal and they turn around and say, you spelled a word wrong. That's all they care about. Appearances. But then they'll get down and dirty and call you all the names under the sun and say, oh yes, but you're in a position of power. You have to be held to a higher standard. What, so you don't believe in equality? You don't believe in a class-free system? They're all mighty hypocrites. And yeah, you can see from the news. Now, isn't it funny? Yesterday, did I not mention yesterday that the Ukrainians did not have any air defences in their convoys? Not one of their convoys featured had air defences. And here they are today in a so-called anti-air defence unit. You know what this reminds me of? Command and Conquer Generals. The machine gun mounted on the back of Toyota. Brought to you by the Taliban. The Americans mounted M2s on the back of Jeeps back in World War II. And how many aircraft did those guys shoot down? Fuck all and none. Okay? It's like when they mounted machine guns on all the bombers. You know why they stopped doing that? Because they shot down hardly anything. They lost more gunners, right? They lost more gunners than they did aircraft they shot down. They were literally pissing away tons of ammunition that could have gone to fighter escorts. Somebody came up with the brilliant idea. Geez, what if we just increased the size of the fuel tank on the escort fighters and made long-range escort fighters? And lo and behold, more bombers started getting the target. Now, if he was using, say, a tracking system or some sort of shoulder-mounted missile, then I would say, yes, they were effective. You'd be surprised how ineffective some of these, how much ammunition they expended per shoot down. And it's just unbelievable waste of resources. And most of Al Jazeera is repeating The Guardian, which is also why I'm mostly skipping them. But at least they acknowledge the Russians are advancing. Mostly because they cannot hide it. Their own maps. Okay. Remember, this is a Ukrainian map, not a Russian map. And the Russian aviation has renewed airstrikes. Yesterday, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced the return of airstrikes by the Su-25. Now, I did not see any report. I went back months looking for it. There was no report about Su-25s being withdrawn. Then I've come across the story, and then it suddenly dawned on me. When the Ukrainians attacked the Russian air bases, a lot of the aircraft at angles were damaged and relocated. Now, where they were relocated is probably somewhere up here, past the Urals, to where the bulk of Russian manufacturing is, by the way. Oh, military manufacturing, I mean. Right? For repairs. They never announced how many or anything like that. So sometimes when you see an announcement by the Russians, you suddenly realise that, oh yeah, they didn't make any prior announcement. But I should have noticed that there were no Su-25 strikes on Ukraine. But they rarely actually tell you the aircraft they use as well. And a lot of them are actually MiG-35s or Su-35s. But the return of Su-25s, well, a lot of MiG-25s and, well, anything below a MiG-27 was due to be scrapped. Russia was scrapping a lot of its aircraft. But a lot of Su-25s were meant to be sold off. Guess who was actually meant to be buying them? So I think the conflict between Ukraine and Russia was about Ukraine wanting special treatment and not getting it. And the amount of anger and tantrums since 91 just kept increasing to the point where the Ukrainian nationalism reached boiling point. I honestly think Russia underestimated how idiotic, and I think the rest of Eastern Europe really has poured all their angst into Russia instead of accepting their own role in communism, right? It takes two. Most communists are women or weak men. Most of the Russian people were not pro-communist. You saw that with the fall of the Soviet Union. Now we have fighting in the buffer zone with what appears to be a little bit of movement. But again, it could just be the way the map has rendered. So don't read anything into it because there's no movement in the north here. There's a little bit of fighting here and there. But Russia's maintaining the pressure on Ukraine rather than outright trying to annihilate. Now again, it's part of their strategy to draw off troops from other areas of the combat. Because once Kupiansk falls, Ukrainians might actually each city that falls, I mean, Kupiansk isn't as important to the Russians as other areas as well. But there are areas, as you can see, in the Lyman area where fighting is continued and the Russians haven't made significant advances, but they've made minute advances. Or should I say, advances in areas of importance strategically, but it allows them to, strike deeper into Ukraine because they can bring up more men and machines. But unfortunately, it leaves Ukrainians on their flanks. And Seversk, they've only managed to conduct assaults on the outskirts of Seversk. Now we go to through the north of Travis Yar, of which there's no real movement. No significant movement in Kosk. There's still street fighting in Kosk and south of Kosk and around, but the Russians have made some advances outside of Kosk, but still there's these areas here which remain in Ukrainian control. The Russians have only made small advances north or Now, Myriad fighting has broken out in parts of Myriad, but those are just assaults. Russians have made advances south and east of Pokrovsk, as you can see, Miscalculation, and that have been all but taken. There's a little bit of Pokrovsk half of Pokrovsk remaining in remaining in Ukrainian hands. The Ukrainians are holding on to this rail junction, but the Russians have made more, yesterday, look at that huge tactical shift, which is because, again, as I said, the Ukrainians were moving troops into here. The Russians have cut them off. But there's still a bit of this line still operating. The Russians haven't completely severed the rail line. I think in part because they want to use it themselves once they gain full control of parts. But they're going to have to consider what to do about which way want to go. Because really, tactically, they do need to flank these towns and start cutting off reinforcements and supplies. Airdrops will last about a month or two before the losses mount up in aircraft, and that will significantly give the Russians an advantage if they can flank them. But the cost in manpower might be too much. Just remember what I said earlier about the Duma. The Duma is pressuring Putin. Keep losses below whatever level they've agreed to that allowed him to go to war. Remember, a lot of things in Russia are constitutionally constrained. Putin is not an absolute monarch. And in many ways, his power over Russia is not as much as, Putin can issue orders, but a lot of them still have to be approved by committees or the Duma or certain select committees of the Russian parliament, such as the National Security Committee. And again, these are not transparent, so you don't always hear about them. But now and again you hear that you see Russian opposition, and they caution Putin to show results. So even though there are results, they're not pleased. And there's now and again there has been what they call a review, a strategic review of the situation, and they are on thin ice, I think, more than they will admit to, that the Duma and the National Security Committee, just remember the head of the Russian opposition actually runs the National Security Committee. I don't know how he was elected to that position, being Putin's opposition, if Putin's an absolute monarch, But so there you go. People always... I think the left just smears... I mean, sometimes the right smears Putin as well. But, why would you make so many lies and assumptions? I mean, I guess the left are just so childish. The truth should be enough, okay? But the left just cannot help themselves. They always have to smear. They always have to exaggerate. And they never consider the possibility they're wrong. And most of the people out there are not going to fact check them. And even if you do fact check the left, they're not going to change. Right? Once you see how much they lie, you should never, ever support any left-wing candidate again. That's why I don't like swing voters. Right? They're cowards. They wait for the election before they do anything. And then all they do is moan and groan no matter what happens. Nothing's ever good enough for them. So they can go fuck themselves as far as I'm concerned. They don't like me. They don't like anybody, really. They're perpetual butthurt. And they enjoy, making others miserable. It's like, you don't need that level of toxicity in your life. And the type, right? The perpetual butthurt. Now, you can tell by the map that Russia's significantly shifting. Okay? For a long time, this battle group center has dominated this war. It's now, for some reason, shifting. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's Yug, but I may be wrong. But the battle group here, with the amount of action and activity, clearly has had an influx of, or a breakthrough. Now, given troop rotations haven't been announced yet, but they could be receiving the first batch of reserves to begin rotations, but they've clearly increased the amount of offensive actions. So they've had a breakthrough, or at least the possibility of one. Or, as I said before, as we get near the end of the war, we'll see an increase in activity. And also with winter, we are going to see a 30-day offensive, whether this is the prelude or just the probing attacks to begin. We do not know until we see a constant pattern. We do know that this could be anywhere from a week to a month away. It's always hard to tell when the Ukrainian lines are going to crack, because 2 days ago, the Russians were here, and suddenly they go, well, we'll just race up. Ukraine's left an opening. Boom, we'll race up this road, take this territory. And don't forget, there's probably a lot of areas where the Ukrainians are relying on missiles and artillery instead of, they can't have troop lines, they can't have 600,000 kilometers of troop lines, okay? You think about it, 1,000 kilometer front, and then you've got to layer that, and then you've got to have all the dummies and fallback positions and all the bunkers. That's a lot of work. Ukraine has been building for 10 years all these bunker buildings. And the Russians have been sitting there watching them build. And notice that they're building east from west to east, not east to west. And ever increasing the number of bunkers and setting up. And remember, they're using the same battle lines from Napoleon, probably all the way back, all the You may laugh, but a lot of your American highways were horse trails. A lot of European roads were once laid out by the Romans, and the Romans followed probably Celtic hunters, and Celtic hunters probably followed the elves. And you may laugh at that, but there is actually small amounts of historical evidence to suggest that the Celts were not the first. Even the Celts themselves acknowledge that there were people before them. And to say that they were black is ridiculous, because we actually have Ice Age bodies and they're pure white. Okay? They're whiter then than they are now. And we have no pre-Ice Age bodies. Okay? There's no bodies before the Ice Age bodies. Okay? We don't even have fragments of calcites to say that there were... The oldest evidence of humans, I believe, recently found was actually in Greece. Yet these black supremacists keep whining about the Caucasus Mountains. It's like, so what? You know, you come from caves in South Africa. You know, like, you learnt a little bit of, you learnt one little thing, and then you make this huge. You come from a cave. You know, like, dude, right? Aboriginal Australians lived in caves for 75,000 years, you know? It's not an insult. And look what we build today compared to what they can build in Africa. Okay? But civilization, yeah, we're allowing the savages to destroy it, okay? And you want civilization, you're going to have to live with the fact that Russia gets to choose its government, and you got to stop whining about it. The sooner the better. There's a collapse of trust around the world right now in Chinese banks. Even as we speak, there is a major investigation. There were raids in Shanghai today of Chinese banks. Audits. Looking for secret books. Looking for... Some of these banks have failed to maintain proper data records, backups, proper accounting methods, refusing to give paper receipts for transactions, recording deposits into savings account as financial instruments, and then literally gambling the money away. And the EU right now is ruining any chance they have of rescuing their own financial system by engaging in a selfish war against the Russian Federation, because the only way the Europeans can now grow their economy is to try and confiscate the wealth of Russians who they wanted peace with, and to open up their markets to Russian investment so that there would be no incentive for war, because Russia would be dependent on Europe. But somebody and this is on Trump too, stop panicking every time a Russian is successful. Yeah, Russia may have contributed to this with the corruption in Boris Yeltsin's era. Now, Putin has tried to claw back some of the stolen wealth, but some of the arbitration courts have said, well, you can't rewrite contracts, even as, right? So, it's basically accepted that some of these people who fled Russia for Europe, right, and have stolen billions of dollars, are being protected by Europe. And then now Europe is trying to take the money off them and give it to Ukraine instead of back to Russia. It doesn't make sense. You have a golden opportunity. But see, the problem is, politically, the left will not vote for any politician who does anything nice. You have to be nasty to be a left-wing politician. and then go on TV and preach how nasty the right wing are and that we're the good guys. The two-faced rat, and the Romans recognized this. They recognized all the way back with Janus that the politician is a two-faced rat. That he will speak sweet words to the voter and then sweet words to the donor. And he's lying to both. And trying to fool one into giving him money and the other to give him his trust and his vote. The Roman Republic should have been a warning to the world. But the problem is the monarchy was worse for corruption. Again, it was the most efficient government, and despite the corruption of the monarchy, you had worse with democracy. Systemic corruption of the majority, voting to steal off the rich. And then complaining when prices are high. It's constant whining. You cannot have cheap food and high wages. You have to sacrifice to the middle ground. Now, Russia was fairly evenly distributed wealth for so long, but which meant talent could not advance. And still today, yes, Russia is more political than it is merit, but Europe is far worse. People of merit don't go anywhere in Europe. They have to go to anybody who gets any white man who gets any decent education in Europe has to leave because Europe is so obsessed with brown people and feminism. Women are ruining the world with their greedy, selfish, nasty, but it's not fair whine. And it's the feminist. It's the gutless. It's the two-faced rat of Europe. It's fueling the war. And Germany, who is fractured, to say the least, mentally and physically, is kowtowing to Zelensky's demands for more money. You all know, right, that this is going to be spent in America on weapons. Now, Zelensky is toured. Now, the Russians have designated the Azov Battalion as a neo-Nazi, and we've seen many in America recognize some of these tattoos and go, holy cow, you know, they're members of the Black Sun. You can look it up. It's a cult. Now, it's born out of the Thule Society and other, and these do predate the Nazis, but they became a standard of the Nazi Party, okay? And a lot of fascism in Europe were obsessed with these cults and so forth. But the Thule Society was deeply embedded in the SS. But there was a point where Germany was split between a left-wing and a right-wing faction of the Nazi Party. Basically the socialists and the communists. But the brown shirts, whether it was paranoia or Himmler lying, we'll never know. But the communists pretty much pulled the party apart, and Hitler decided basically to purge. Now this happens in China, this happens in every communist country as well, and you're going to see it happen in New York. You are going to see political purging. You are going to see more and more selective laws passed, and it's going to hurt the economy so much. And this is what Roosevelt did in the 1930s. He sunk the 1920s to 1930. The Roosevelt and the Democrats sunk the American economy on purpose so they could afford a massive army on a minimal budget. Remember, right? Somebody said if the American military budget in 1932 was only something like $129 billion or something. It was a huge percentage of the GDP, though. But if you looked at the 1920s, $129 billion would have been a small amount of the GDP, but instead of costing thousands of dollars, a Patton tank would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. The American military budget would have never... American battleships were built for a fraction of their price. They built 6 aircraft carriers less than what the Japanese could build them for. Nowadays, of course, they cost billions of dollars. But still, you consider the price versus inflation, right? The Enterprise, for instance, I think 74, the last version or whatever, cost something like $1.2 billion, and today its replacement $13 billion. The inflation doesn't add up, you know. And again, that's because when you're dealing with such big numbers, yet such little workforce, a lot of it just doesn't make sense. And again, it's because they're never going to tell you the truth, right? They never balance the budget. The government never says how much of the budget they've spent, right? We do know that there are audits to say, oh yeah, the Pentagon was given all this budget, but they, fell short, and then they say, oh, that's because equipment actually cost more than than the estimates, and those were in budget adjustments, so long story short, you never get the truth, right? And again, a lot of the time, they say, oh, but that would help our enemies. Well, who's your freaking enemy? It's the people, of course. Russia knows how much a freaking artillery piece costs because they make them. Recently, Putin taunted and found a fact that a Russian artillery piece versus an American artillery piece. The American artillery piece may have a slightly longer range, but it costs 2.5 times the cost. And on the battlefield, their accuracy is the same. Okay? The accuracy of if the American M777 was that accurate, Russian artillery would be hunkered down behind big bloody sand walls, and as soon as they fire, they'd be relocating, not anchored down and engaged in repeat battery fire. It's the M777s who are on the move to avoid Russian drones. Here the Russians are operating out in the open. It's almost as if Ukraine is piss poor mismanaged. What happened to all the German air defenses? What happened to, again, where's all these Toyota pickup trucks with their M2s, which are, again, I would suggest they're pointless. But it's a dire situation. It's a wound of their own making. It's the arrogance and ignorance of Zelensky who keeps this war running. But it's also the fact that the vast majority will not get out of their own arrogant shadow and accept reality. Zelensky's made statements about Kupiansk which don't make sense. This leads Russia to ask, which is it? Is Zelensky out of touch? Is he misinformed? Is he deliberately putting out false reports, or is he receiving false reports? Does he understand the situation? Or they're just hiding the truth and prefer the inglorious death of thousands of Ukrainians? I put to you, it is a combination of they want a bloodbath. Remember, the Russian government was destabilized in 1917 by the sudden collapse of the line in, I forget where it exactly was, but in World War One, the Russian lines collapsed. The Tsar was so out of touch because the people around him were just so corrupt and incompetent. They were hiding the fact that Russian arms industry was producing nowhere near enough rifles for the men. Most of the food wasn't making it to the front. It was being stolen by the people. The Russian peasants were stealing the food. But it was a long, hard winter, and food production, agriculture was lying about the food production. This is why truth matters. When you surround yourself with liars, you're going to be lied to. But Zelensky, I think, is deliberately misinforming the public so that when there's a bloodbath, a huge Russian victory, they can panic Europe and start his holy war. And I showed you yesterday, he called for a holy war against Russia and China. Oddly enough, not India. Because I think India is fueling both sides of this war. I don't think Germany. Remember, this is why I showed you why it's so important. Germany. Allocated $8.5 billion in its budget for next year, out of $200 billion, the estimated budget for Ukraine, on a country that normally has a GDP of $127 billion, which is down 50%. So we don't know the exact figures, but it's believed to be $54 billion, or dropped even further. See, they've had Germany's had annual contraction of its economy, partly because of its cheap fuel. As a result of its sanctions on Moscow, it's lost 13% of its trade. It wants to inflict a strategic defeat on Moscow so that it can expand its holdings by taking over Russian companies throughout Eastern Europe, not just in Germany. But the question remains, where's the rest of the money coming from? And what is Ukraine promising or selling? We recently heard that Ukraine was selling arms. Sudan and India, I think, are the main beneficiaries. Where's Ukraine getting these arms to sell? How is it that Zelensky is building an arms industry in Denmark, of all places? And this is the problem. When your morality is a spinning compass. Okay? Normally you'd have a triangle, right? You have needs, wants, desires. But you'd have a moral compass. So your desires are the least. So you've got to balance your needs and wants. But when it comes to desires, there's always that pull towards desire, right? But morality, is supposed to push back against desire. But when your desire is power and wealth, it just overwhelms you, and you'll sacrifice people's needs for your wants and desires. So instead of the ball being backwards and forwards between needs and desires, it becomes between wants and desires. And you soon find yourself in a situation where, we will get utopia if we have power. And then when they're in power and things go bad, they keep saying, the opposition is stopping us. And the fools will believe it, which means you now have the tyranny of the majority, which is what happened in Nazi Germany. The tyranny of the majority is what happened in Rome. Okay? The Roman government, in order to maintain its power, brought in Greeks to oppress the Romans, and the Greeks and the Romans brought in Semites to run the financial sector because they couldn't trust each other. Then they sacrificed all the workers on various roads and that with cheap labour from across North Africa, and soon Rome found itself either Roman farmers would have been forced to become soldiers in order to own land, and even if they returned home from war, which most of them didn't, they soon found themselves lost their land to taxes, and the Roman senators using slaves to farm the land cheaper than the farmer could farm the land and produce more crops. And on top of that, the farmer was expected to produce 18 bushels, where most land couldn't even produce 12. And on top of that, they had a tax to pay in a mandatory fixed fee on that land, which soon saw that land forked over, so that most of them would just sell the land to the Lord and become a tenant farmer. And basically, by tenant farmer, I mean oppress the minority. And this is what happens when you go from meeting the needs of your people to meeting the needs of others. Yet, time and time again, you fail to learn that lesson and open your doors to bullshit. So here I think the Russians have failed to pick up on that and believe and realize that Zelensky is no longer meeting the needs of his people. He's meeting the wants of those in power and the desires of those in power. Those who should not have power in Ukraine have power because they have the gun, just like in China. And if Putin isn't careful, the Russian military will run Russia into the ground as well, because it will eventually go, geez, we sacrificed all these men. We need a big victory to show off so we can have a. You underestimate ego. And you underestimate when the majority have no power, when the democracy is an illusion. Unless the people are armed, they have no power. And if you allow too many foreigners into your country, the people have no power. Ukraine is destroying Ukraine so that Ukrainians have no power. And Zelensky doesn't care because he's ethnically not a Ukrainian and religiously not a Ukrainian. He's a Russian Jew. Now, we saw an M2. An M2 is a 50 caliber. A Zu-23 is a 23mm twin. It fires 2 explosive rounds. And as you can see, one pop actually one pop, boom. And that's about 100 to 200 yards. Yeah. The Russians, he's excited. Well, it's one shot, one kill. Getting one kill from one shot. Yeah, he only shot one barrel, by the way. You can hear. Here he goes again. This is a different one. He's using it's a different. Different models over the years have different tracking sites. There we have, but we see the missiles have failed, so it's come down to the gunner, and he fires and misses, then fires and hits. Somebody else hit it. So the Russian military, you don't know which is accurate or whatever, but from my experience, limited experience, I would say these are overlays. But these crosshairs, meaningless, okay? Why would you put them in? Okay, optical tracking, when you're looking in the receptacle, you actually... crosshairs are often on optical tracking, as far as I know, are not digital. Okay, I've seen enough digital footage. Most of them don't have crosshairs. I think they're added. But it doesn't matter. The point is, they're not blasting on the back of a truck with a belt fed going for the cameras. They're carefully conserving ammunition. And they're turning drone shooting into skeet shootings. And if you're in air defense, you're a pretty cushy job. You're rarely targeted. You're usually way back, and you're defending yourself in theory, right? Even though most drones are not coming for you, you're going to have to treat every drone that enters your sector as a possible... having the possibility of you being the target. You got to treat it like that, right? You got to say, I got a range of 500 kilometers. You say, right, anything coming in that 500 kilometer range has a possibility of hitting me. I'm sure they may prefer to hit the factory, but if you send 20 missiles and none of them get through, eventually you're going to target the air defender to get the next lot through. Because that's what Russia's doing. Russia is targeting air defenses. And I'm sure most of the time, given the usual amount of ammunition, I think these guys would normally be pumping out a few shots. But these are surveillance drones by the look of them. So they're treating it as a skeet shoot. Because they know if they miss... it don't matter. They're surveillance drones, and they're gonna, as soon as a surveillance drone that comes into your area, doesn't matter if you miss because you're gonna relocate. Because if you shoot it down or not shoot it down, doesn't matter. The enemy knows you're there. All right, they've seen the image. Unless you're jamming them, in which case, why would you shoot it down if it's jammed? Because it's just gonna go round and round and round and crash. It's just soon gonna crash. No, you shooting it down, it means they know your position. So you're going to have to, before you relocate, You shoot the drone down anyway, because your bullet costs less. You know, one bullet. They might. That's what they might have. You know, like it depends. I don't know enough about the Russian chain of command, but I do know they do actually have penalties, and I think the US do too, for shooting without permission. Right? Even in a war, there's rules of engagement. Right? I remember something about soldier in Iraq Afghanistan was prosecuted because she shot an enemy combatant without permission. This is weird, but it happens. And the Ukrainian war is going to have definitely a lot of crazy things happen, because it's a crazy war. It's a mad situation in which you cannot point to the Russians, you cannot point to the Ukrainians and say, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy. Right? What we have is two people who've had such a bad relationship, but Putin didn't start this war. Zelensky had promised to end the war and he didn't. So it is Zelensky's fault, 70-30. And now we're looking at the situation is, can Zelensky stand up and say, is he lying? But he doesn't, because it'll expose him either as a liar or a fool who fell for other people's lies. And when it comes to politicians, they're two-faced rats. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And please support the channel. You can support me on Ko-Fi, Patreon, of which I have 2. So please, you can support me on support my writing. Somebody, please. I want to make a living. Please. Right. Now, primarily, I do want people to buy my books and merch. Now, my links are in the link tree, description below, in my profile, or scan the QR code on the screen. Please and thank you. See you in the next video, and bye for now.